The students of the Ekaran Interstellar Academy were gathered in the observation hall, their elongated forms perched on the floating cushions designed to accommodate their semi-buoyant physiology. They had spent the last few months studying the biology of different species across the galaxy, and today was their first live demonstration with an actual human. Professor Zinal floated at the front of the hall, his soft blue bioluminescence pulsing with scholarly enthusiasm. "Now," he intoned, waving a delicate appendage, "as we have discussed, humans are a remarkable species despite their physical frailty. Their bodies are composed of soft tissues, a brittle skeletal structure, and a nervous system that registers pain with alarming intensity. Theoretically, they should be among the least durable species in the known galaxy. Today, we will observe their fragility in a controlled setting." The students murmured among themselves, their large, compound eyes flickering with intrigue. They had read about humans, of course, how they were prone to injury, how their biology was remarkably inefficient at withstanding trauma compared to more robust species. Some even doubted the stories that claimed humans could endure extreme conditions. How could something so soft survive in a universe filled with creatures that could regenerate limbs or withstand atmospheric pressures that would crush a human in seconds? Then the human arrived. He walked in on his own, despite the deep gash on his forearm. The students tensed. One even let out a startled chirp. The human who introduced himself as Daniel Reeves looked down at his arm and waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, this? It's just a scratch, only stings a little bit. I tripped on my way here. Didn't want to be late." The wound was deep, seeping red fluid. Professor Zinal had to resist the urge to call for medical assistance immediately, though he knew it was unnecessary. A team of trained Ekaran medics hovered nearby, their medical drones already scanning Daniel's vitals. Every test in this study was to be monitored in real time to ensure the human's safety. "Mr. Reeves," Zinal said carefully, "you are aware that your arm is damaged, correct?" Daniel glanced down again and sighed. "Yeah, I probably should clean this up. Got any disinfectant?" One of the medics stepped forward, their translucent limbs adjusting a hovering medical drone. "We will treat the injury before we proceed." A student raised an appendage hesitantly. You are not in pain." Daniel gave a half smile. "Oh, I definitely feel it. But it's not that bad. I once stepped on a rusty nail as a kid. That was worse." The murmuring in the hall increased. "A rusty nail? Stepped on it? And he survived?" Professor Zinal cleared his throat. "We were planning on demonstrating minor pain stimuli today, but it appears you have already provided us with an unintended case study. However, for the sake of academic rigor, we must continue. Do you consent to controlled pain endurance exercises?" Daniel shrugged. "Sure, sounds fun." Fun. The word sent a ripple of bewilderment through the class. The first test was minor electrical stimuli, the kind that would cause an Ekaran to recoil in distress. The current was calibrated well below human pain thresholds, and the medic stood by, monitoring Daniel's response. He barely flinched. "That tingles." The second was exposure to extreme cold. His skin flushed red, but he clenched his jaw and withstood it without protest. "Okay, that one actually hurts a bit," he admitted, flexing his fingers afterward. The medical drone hovered near him, tracking nerve responses, but he remained well within safe parameters. The third test was pressure endurance, a gradual increase in localized force applied to his arm, simulating crushing. The students watched in horrified fascination as he exhaled slowly, muttered something under his breath, and let the pressure increase far beyond what was deemed tolerable for a human. The medic beside him monitored his bone structure with a scanner, ensuring no damage was occurring. Okay, that's enough," he finally said. "Any more and I think I'll actually break something." The students were speechless. One of them, a small Ekaran named Velto, finally gathered the courage to speak. But you feel all of this? You are experiencing pain, yes." "Oh, absolutely," Daniel said. "Humans aren't immune to pain. We just learn to deal with it. Some better than others. Trust me, not everyone back home is built like this." Professor Zinal tapped a claw against his notes. "Fascinating. And this ability to tolerate pain, is it genetic or trained? Daniel scratched his chin, thinking. Bit of both. Some people have a naturally high threshold. Others build it up through life. Pain sucks, sure, but it's part of living. If you let it control you, you're in trouble. The students exchanged nervous glances. This was beyond anything they had imagined. They had expected a weak, easily incapacitated species. What they found instead was something far stranger: creatures that felt pain deeply yet carried on regardless. Professor Zinel, struggling to process what he was witnessing, composed himself. I believe we should proceed with more observations. If you are willing, Mr. Reeves, we would like to see just how much the human body can endure. Daniel grinned. Sounds like a challenge. I'm in. The students braced themselves. They had no idea what they were about to witness. The classroom had never been so quiet. Velto's appendages twitched as they scribbled down notes, eyes flicking between their datapad and Daniel Reeves, the human who had just upended everything they thought they knew about pain tolerance. Professor Zinel cleared his throat, his bioluminescence pulsing with uncertainty. Mr. Reeves, your resilience is unexpected. I must admit, the results so far suggest that we have underestimated the human capacity for endurance. However, we must continue our research with more varied conditions to fully understand your species' limitations. Daniel stretched his arms, wincing slightly at the wound that had already been treated by the medical drones. Yeah? What's next? Zinel hesitated. He had expected mild reactions, a few yelps of discomfort, maybe even a request to stop. Instead, the human remained unnervingly casual. The professor tapped at his datapad, adjusting the next experiment parameters. We will now proceed with thermal variation. We have already observed your reaction to cold, but I believe heat will yield different results. A mechanical arm extended from the lab's central pillar, its tip glowing as the heat gradually increased. The test was designed to trigger a defensive withdrawal instinct. For most species, even brief exposure would cause immediate retreat. Daniel held out his arm. The students watched in disbelief as the temperature climbed. His skin flushed, then reddened, sweat forming almost immediately. The human's teeth clenched, but he didn't pull away. Velto let out a soft chirp. How is he not moving? Daniel exhaled through his nose. I've had sunburns worse than this. Zinel hesitated before increasing the intensity. The heat grew unbearable for any rational being, but Daniel only gritted his teeth, shifting slightly. His skin was dangerously close to blistering. The hovering medical drone pulsed red. The supervising medic immediately stepped forward. Professor Zinel, we are reaching unsafe thresholds for epidermal integrity. But Zinel deactivated the heat source at once. Enough. Any further would cause severe tissue damage. Daniel shook out his arm, flexing his fingers. Good call. I was about to tap out. A murmur spread through the students. Tap out? He had been seconds away from injury, yet he had not recoiled in pain or protest. One of the students, Corin, adjusted their eyepiece. You would have let yourself burn before stopping. Daniel shrugged. I figured you'd stop before it got too bad. He examined his reddened skin with mild curiosity. Besides, burns heal. Eventually. The murmurs grew louder. Zinel's bioluminescent glow flickered erratically. Mr. Reeves, do you understand that most species would have withdrawn immediately? Pain exists as a biological safeguard. Yeah, I get that, Daniel said, wiping sweat from his brow. Humans feel pain too. We just don't always listen to it right away. Velto looked at him, their voice tinged with disbelief. But why? Daniel chuckled. Because sometimes pushing through pain is the only way forward. Ever heard of frostbite? If you stop moving, you die. Sometimes you run on a broken leg because stopping means getting eaten. Pain tells you something's wrong, but it doesn't mean you get to quit. Corin shifted uncomfortably. That is, deeply unsettling. Daniel laughed. You should see human sports. Zinel composed himself and moved on to the next experiment. Controlled lacerations were introduced, carefully calculated incisions designed for medical study rather than distress. The goal was to observe pain response, how quickly a subject sought medical aid, and how efficiently their body healed. Daniel exhaled as the scalpel-like mechanism made a shallow but precise cut along his forearm. The medical drone hovered close, ready to sterilize and seal the wound if necessary. He winced but didn't recoil. Instead, he just muttered, "Yeah, that one stings." The students were horrified. Velto's appendages twitched violently. "He is bleeding. Why is he still so calm?" Daniel inspected the cut with mild curiosity as the medic quickly sealed it with a biogel. "You've really never seen a human bleed before." Zinal deactivated the apparatus. "We have observed human injuries in medical studies, but we were under the impression that your species would react more strongly." Daniel shrugged. "This isn't too bad. Had worse shaving." Corin made a distressed clicking noise. "You cut yourselves during grooming." Daniel laughed. "Not on purpose." Zinal was still struggling to process the data. "Your nervous system should be signaling intense distress." "Oh, it definitely is," Daniel admitted. "But I've had worse." Velto couldn't take it anymore. How much worse? Daniel leaned back, thinking. "One time I broke my ribs in a biking accident. Breathing hurt for weeks." The students reeled at the thought. Corin looked faint. Daniel continued. "Another time I dislocated my shoulder and had to pop it back in myself. That sucked." The medic monitoring him spoke up, their voice careful. "You performed a realignment on your own shoulder, without medical intervention." Daniel nodded. "Yeah, it hurt like hell, but I didn't have much of a choice." Zinal set down his datapad. "Mr. Reeves, you are telling me you suffered severe bodily trauma and continued functioning." Daniel nodded. "Pretty much." Zinal looked at his students. "I believe we have drastically miscalculated human durability." Velto, still staring at Daniel, whispered, "I don't think they even know how fragile they're supposed to be." Daniel grinned. "Nah, we know. We just don't let it stop us." The experiments weren't over. The students weren't ready for what came next. Velto had nearly run out of space on their datapad. Every time they thought they had recorded the most absurd fact about human endurance, Daniel Reeves did something else that made them question everything they had learned. The students were no longer sitting comfortably on their floating cushions. Some had backed away entirely, their appendages curled in distress. Corin had abandoned their usual scientific detachment and now sat rigidly, gripping their datapad like it was the only thing keeping them tethered to reality. Professor Zinal took a moment to compose himself before addressing Daniel again. His bioluminescence flickered uncertainly. "Mr. Reeves, in light of what we have observed, I would like to propose one final test in this session." Daniel, who had been stretching as if he had just finished a light workout rather than hours of endurance trials, grinned. "Hit me with it." Velto immediately interjected, "No, do not hit him with anything. That is the problem." Daniel laughed. "Figure of speech." Corin muttered, "Humans and their reckless language." Zinal ignored them and continued. "This will be a test of your species' biological and neurological response to intoxication and poison resistance. We have selected a variety of compounds, all at safe, non-lethal doses, to assess how human metabolism processes them. Each test will be supervised by our medical team to ensure no lasting effects." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "So, what, you're asking me to drink weird alien booze?" Zinal hesitated. "If that phrasing makes the experiment clearer, then yes." Daniel clapped his hands together. "Best test yet." Velto covered their eyes. "I cannot continue witnessing this." A tray was presented, containing several vials. Each substance had been carefully measured to induce mild to moderate effects in various species. Some caused dizziness, others muscle fatigue or temporary confusion. One was derived from a plant that triggered violent nausea in most carbon-based life forms. Zinal gestured toward the selection. "You may choose any of these. We will monitor your physiological response." Daniel examined the options. "Okay, this one looks like ethanol." Corin adjusted their eyepiece. "You recognize it?" Daniel nodded. Yeah, humans already have alcohol. We metabolize it pretty well. Some better than others. He picked up the vial and downed it in one motion. Yep. Tastes like cheap vodka. Velto was gripping their datapad like it was a lifeline. He just consumed a controlled intoxicant like it was water. Zinal blinked. We will monitor for delayed effects, but based on his reaction, I suspect we need a stronger compound. Daniel tapped the tray. What about this one? Looks thick. Zinal hesitated. That is a neuroinhibitor derived from the Torvalis fungus. In most species, it induces temporary disorientation and partial motor control impairment. Daniel tilted his head. Like getting drunk. Corin frowned. Drunk. Daniel grinned. Oh, you guys are in for a treat. He picked up the vial and took a small sip. Whew, that's got a kick. The students watched in horror. Zinal was rapidly taking notes. Fascinating. You appear to still be fully coherent. Daniel rolled his shoulders. Yeah, I don't feel much yet. Maybe a little warm. Velto's appendages twitched. That dose would have incapacitated a Serenian within minutes. Daniel smirked. Humans have a long history of consuming things that probably should have killed us. Zinal took a measured breath. You speak as though this is common. Oh, it is, Daniel said casually. We experiment with food, drink, medicine, you name it. Someone, at some point in history, ate something they absolutely shouldn't have just to see what would happen. Corin shuddered. Your species is beyond reckless. Daniel laughed. Hey, that's how we figured out which mushrooms wouldn't kill us. Velto was staring at him. That implies many of your kind died in the process. Oh yeah, tons. Zinal could not believe what he was hearing. Your species has actively used trial and error in matters of survival. Daniel shrugged. How else do you learn? The room fell into stunned silence. Velto finally spoke, voice quiet. And yet you persist. Daniel grinned. Exactly. Zinal glanced at the tray. Would you be willing to try a non-lethal toxin? Corin's eyes widened. Professor. Zinal raised a hand. Only if he consents. This is for science. Daniel leaned forward. Define non-lethal. This, in other species, induces nausea, dizziness, and mild hallucinations. The effects last no longer than an hour. Daniel considered this. All right, let's see what happens. Velto made a strangled noise. Daniel lifted the vial, took a deep breath, and drank. The students braced for immediate effects. Minutes passed. Daniel blinked. Huh. That's weird. Feels kind of tingly. Corin checked the readings. His vitals are stable. Zinal was watching carefully. Any dizziness? Disorientation? Daniel thought for a moment. Not really. Velto stared. That should not be possible. Daniel stood up, stretching. I think it just made my fingers feel a little numb. Corin was rapidly typing. We need to reassess human toxin resistance. Daniel cracked his knuckles. You should see some of the stuff we willingly eat. Ever heard of fugu? Zinal hesitated. Fugu. Daniel grinned. It's a fish with a neurotoxin. If it's not prepared correctly, it can kill you. People still eat it. The room erupted into chaos. Velto threw down their datapad. I am done. I refuse to believe any of this. Corin shook their head. You are all insane. Zinal took a deep breath, then nodded. I believe we have completed our study. Velto turned to Daniel, exhaustion evident in their expression. What? What are humans? Daniel grinned. Survivors. The students left the lab in stunned silence. They had come expecting to study a weak, fragile species. Instead, they had witnessed something far more terrifying. Humans did not avoid pain. They endured it. And sometimes they even sought it out. Velto's appendages trembled as they recorded their notes, though at this point they were no longer sure why. Everything they had learned about human fragility had been methodically torn apart, one experiment at a time. The endurance trials should have ended after the toxin resistance test, but Professor Zinel still wasn't satisfied. This study has yielded extraordinary results, Zinel admitted, his bioluminescence flickering in contemplation. However, one crucial aspect of human endurance remains untested. Corin shifted uncomfortably. Professor, surely we have seen enough. The human has already exceeded all known pain thresholds. Must we continue? Zinel's glow pulsed steadily as he turned toward Daniel. Mr. Reeves, do you consent to one final experiment? Daniel, who had been idly balancing a datapad on his knee, grinned. Sure. What's next? You gonna launch me into deep space and see how long I last? Velto let out an alarmed chirp. No, Zinel said quickly, though the idea seemed to disturb him. We wish to assess your ability to function under prolonged stress conditions. Not merely pain, but exhaustion, both physical and mental endurance over time. Daniel tilted his head. You mean like see how long I can keep moving? Precisely, Zinel confirmed. Many species reach a critical point of failure when pushed beyond their natural energy reserves. We wish to determine where that threshold lies for humans. Daniel rolled his shoulders. Relax. I've pulled all-nighters before. How bad can it be? Velto covered their eyes. I do not think I will survive this. The observation hall was reconfigured to accommodate the next stage of testing. Daniel would be subjected to a constant state of exertion, physical movement paired with cognitive challenges, all while preventing rest. The medics adjusted the monitoring systems to track his vital signs in real time, ready to intervene the moment they detected danger. The treadmill hummed to life beneath Daniel's feet. Floating screens displayed shifting symbols, logic sequences, and tactical scenarios. The lighting in the hall fluctuated to mimic sleep deprivation conditions. Daniel stepped onto the treadmill without hesitation. All right, let's do this. The test began. His initial pace was steady, controlled. The students whispered among themselves, some already showing signs of unease. For most species, voluntary exertion at this level would last no more than 2 hours before fatigue set in. After 3 hours, Daniel was still moving. His breathing had deepened, but his posture remained strong. He solved every cognitive challenge correctly, albeit at a slightly slower speed. After 4 hours, his movements had become less precise. He rolled his shoulders, shaking out his arms as if loosening tension. Sweat beaded along his brow, but he made no attempt to stop. Velto had begun recording time markers, expecting him to falter at any moment. Yet, he didn't. You have been in constant motion for an unnatural length of time, Corin muttered. Daniel exhaled sharply. Yeah, well, you ever worked retail during the holiday season? Velto's datapad nearly slipped from their grasp. I do not know what that is, but I suspect it is horrible. Daniel chuckled. You have no idea. 6 hours passed. His pace had slowed, but he was still moving. When the first real sign of exhaustion appeared, his hands shaking slightly, the medical drones moved closer, scanning for dangerous fatigue levels. I can keep going, he muttered before they could intervene. Zinel hesitated. Mr. Reeves, you are nearing the limit of most bipedal endurance species. Daniel gave a breathy laugh. You should see ultramarathoners. They run for days. Velto twitched violently. That is not something that should be possible. Daniel wiped his forehead. Yet here we are. At the 8-hour mark, cognitive tests resumed. His reaction time had slowed, but his answers remained correct. He blinked heavily, rubbing his temples, but he remained functional. Zinel studied the readings. Most species experience severe cognitive impairment after sustained exhaustion. Daniel gave a lopsided grin. You ever seen college students during finals week? This is nothing. Velto's voice was barely above a whisper. Why do humans do this? Daniel shrugged. Sometimes you don't have a choice. 10 hours in, his movements became sluggish. His steps were heavier. His blinking lasted a fraction of a second too long. Velto whispered, surely now he must stop. Daniel adjusted his posture, shook out his arms, and kept moving. The students watched in silent horror. By the 12th hour, the medics were on high alert. His vitals were stable, but the strain was evident. "You have nothing left to prove," Zinal finally said. Daniel exhaled. Yeah, probably a good idea to stop. The treadmill powered down. He swayed slightly before stepping off, catching himself with practiced ease. The medical team swarmed him, scanning for muscle damage, dehydration, neurological strain, anything that would indicate permanent harm. Aside from exhaustion, he was fine. Velto was staring at him like he was an incomprehensible force of nature. How are you still functioning?" Daniel rubbed his neck. "You'd be surprised what people can handle when they have to." Zinal studied his notes. Humans do not merely endure pain. They endure depletion. Velto slumped. "I do not believe they understand the concept of limits." Corin shook their head. "I no longer believe humans are fragile." Daniel grinned. "Took you long enough." The students didn't speak as they left the hall. They had expected to study a weak species, one that required caution, safety, and rest. Instead, they had witnessed something terrifying. Humans did not break. They adapted. They endured. And sometimes they suffered on purpose.